About to. Yes, I just started.
Great. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the first in this year's Brown Bag Lunches. Obviously, we're all remote at this point. It's a blessing and a curse in many ways. You know, it's sad not to be in the same room, but it affords some advantages. We're able to record the Brown Bag Lunches for later consumption, and also get people in who wouldn't normally be able to attend these so easily. So we're delighted to see people from all around the university. So welcome to everyone. My name is Duncan Larimer. For those of you who don't know me, I'm serving as the Associate Dean of Research here in the Eberly College, and we do many things here in the research office at Eberly, and this is one of the most enjoyable things that we do, to host these Brown Bag Lunches, where we try to facilitate faculty development in numerous ways. Today we're going to be talking about the National Science Foundation, and I'm going to hand over to Leah in a moment. But just before I do, I want to say how thankful I am to my Leah, Erica, Story, and Matt, my whole team here in the research office, for everything that they do. And also to you, if you have ideas for Brown Bag Lunches in the future, please reach out to us and let us know. We're planning events throughout the academic year, and we'll be keeping you in touch with that. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Leah Herron, who will be hosting the event today. So Leah, please take it away.
Thanks, Duncan. First, let me know if you'd like to introduce who you are in chat. Please don't hesitate to put a note in chat if you want to share that information. We usually go around at the Brown Bag, but I think we'll skip that today for technological reasons. Also, if you want to put any questions in chat, please do so. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions, and also if there's a topic area you want to make sure we cover today, please don't hesitate to put that in chat as well. So welcome everyone. Let me introduce our two panelists today. First, Sharon Bird. Sharon is the Director of Women's and Gender Studies and a Professor of Sociology. She served as Program Director at the NSF for the Advanced Program and for AGEP, which is the Alliances for Graduate Education and the Professoriate. Both of those are in the EHR Directorate. She also worked with core EHR programs as well as the career program. She continues to review for these programs and for the sociology program, and has been funded by NSF Advance and by NSF AGEP. Erik Herron is the Eberly Family Professor of Political Science. He served as Program Director for NSF for the Political Science Program, the Science of Organizations Program, and for the iCorps program. He assisted in secure and trustworthy cyberspace as well. He has also served as an intermittent expert for political science and as a panelist or reviewer for political science, economics, and for the new Security and Preparedness program, and has been funded by the NSF Political Science and Science of Organizations programs. So both Sharon and Erik served as rotators, or otherwise known as visiting scientists. So let me ask Sharon first if she could tell us a little bit about her experience and what you do as a rotator.
Yes, thank you, Leah, Erica, Duncan, everybody. Story, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about grant proposal writing and NSF. I'm also always happy to talk about the time as a rotator there, because I describe it as very challenging experience, but also the most fun I ever had. The process of getting to NSF was after serving as a reviewer on multiple panels of all sorts, but also having had a couple of good-sized grants funded from the National Science Foundation. The job of being a rotator, like I said, is very challenging. You have to learn the whole review process inside and out, and you take on a lot of responsibility. It varies across the different directorates and programs as to how much authority and responsibility you might have. But and Eric, I'm excited to hear what you think about this, but they pretty much just throw you in. And so there's a lot of funding that happens in the course of a year or two or three or up to 4 years as a rotator. in the time that you spend there. Like I said, I can talk on and on, but I'll stop there.
No, I think you covered a lot of the important points. I think that I've characterized it in the past to people as it's like going back to grad school, but only the good parts of grad school. So you learn a tremendous amount. You interact with lots of interesting people. You do have, as Sharon was saying, varied levels of responsibility and authority depending on the program. In my program, we had a pretty significant amount of, I hesitate to use the word power, but discretion over how we approached our funding decisions, with the exception of 1 year when Congress specifically dictated to our program what we could or couldn't fund. And if there are questions about that, I'd be happy to talk about it. Kirk in the chat asked a little bit about life as a rotator, and I would say that it reminded me of my pre-academic life when I worked in a nonprofit organization but had to clock in and out. So there's a bit more of a traditional work environment if you serve as a rotator. At least that's the experience that I had. And it's a bit more like, again, traditional office-like life. You don't have as much control over your schedule as you might as an academic. At the time I was there, my directorate and the people who were in the program with me were very protective of my research time. So one of the benefits that you get as a rotator is time set aside for you to continue your research. Now, I understand that since I was there, the amount of time set aside for research productivity, sort of personal research productivity, has been cut back. But the idea for a rotator is that you come in, you help run the program, you bring in perspectives from the field and from the community, and then you go back out into the community. And one of the ways that they try to entice people to do this is to let them continue their research agenda so that they're not stagnating on their own personal work while they're doing work for the NSF. And I was there for 3 years and found that balance to be very good for me.
Let me ask something, and I know this varies by directorate, but can you talk a little bit about the process? So what is the process that a proposal goes through when it comes in? You know, what happens first with it? You know, like Sharon, did you have ad hoc reviews and then go to panel, et cetera? Could you explain that process a little bit?
Yeah, for the programs for which I served, they were mostly panels. And to the extent that we used ad hoc reviewers, it would be reviewers who have specialized expertise, often who didn't have time to participate in the full panel review process. But ad hoc reviewers would be used differently across different programs. I'm sure Erik can talk about that. The actual process itself, though, your proposal goes in by whatever designated deadline. The program officer is then in the process of choosing who the reviewers will be for a panel that is comprised of often a large number of individuals who will review the proposals. And quickly, the proposal review process itself is a series of recommendations. The reviewers participate in the panel review. They write a summary of each of the proposals, and they give it their various ratings and recommend or not to the program officer for funding. But the reviewers aren't making the decisions about the funding themselves. The program officer then makes a recommendation to the directorate, the leadership of the directorate, and they, right now I'm spacing on the names, the program director. Well, anyway, it's a series of recommendations that go up through the channels. And once your proposal is on the desk of the directorate.
So the DD and the AD.
Yeah, well, I know.
Inclusion director and the assistant director. I flipped my mind too. I had to think about it.
Yeah. But once the program officer has the recommendations that they're pretty confident about, you're almost there. but there may be some decisions left to be made about the amount of funding that can be dispersed in any given cycle. And so it may be that there are 5 proposals that are worthy of funding, and there's not a budget to support them. And in some cases, the proposals that don't get funded immediately, even though they're worthy of it, they may be held over until kind of the end of the fiscal year, when the program officers are, in a sense, looking for which projects didn't get funded that may yet be fundable by going around and asking other program officers if they have enough, to contribute to the funding of the various proposal. But for the most part, proposals get funded at the stage where it's under the purview of the program officer, and the program officer makes the recommendations up the channel. So it's a long process.
Let me ask Erik to add to that, but also to talk a little bit more about how much authority the program directors have. In some funding agencies, whatever the panel decides is what happens, but that's not necessarily true at the NSF. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, let me start with that, and then I'll back up. I mean, Sharon did a great job of covering aspects of the review process. I just want to point out a couple of things in that as well that might vary from program to program. And we do think, of the NSF as a government agency, and so we might think of it as having consistent policies from program to program, but it really does vary quite a bit. So to start with, I just blanked on the question.
The authority.
The authority, thank you. So we as program directors had to manage the budget and the portfolio. So the portfolio is the entire array of projects that we have funded and that we continue to fund. And we're obligated not only to make sure we manage the budget well, and there are lots of details about the budgets within the NSF that you don't need to know, but the bigger picture is how we manage the portfolio, or the more important point is how we manage the portfolio. So that is the types of research that we are funding, the areas, the issue areas, and how they fit into our field. The institutions that we're funding, what we want to make sure that we have a diverse array of institutions, and the PIs that we're funding. We want to be mindful of the diversity of our pool of funded researchers as well as funded research institutions. So with all of that in mind, program directors have a substantial amount of authority. Now, we do tend to defer to reviewers, at least in my program, reviewers in the panel, in the sense that we are looking for the community's recommendations about the best research to fund. And generally speaking, the panel's assessments and our assessments aligned pretty well. But there were times when panel or ad hoc reviewers would dislike something that we thought had merit, or the opposite. And as program directors, we would, I don't consider it override the panel, because they don't have decision-making authority. As Sharon mentioned, this is something you hear at the NSF a lot. It's all about recommendations. We as program directors make recommendations to the division director, and these recommendations go up the chain of command until the final award is made. And in a similar way, the panel makes a recommendation to us. So we would often, I would say we did dissertations and we did standard awards. Every round, we would do something that the panel did not recommend. We did not fund things that the panel liked, and we did fund things that the panel put in non-competitive for all sorts of reasons, which we can talk about. I'm going to stop here, though, and see if you want to follow up on any of the questions. But we had a substantial amount of authority, but we had to be mindful of all of these other issues while making decisions.
Did you want to add to that, Sharon?
Well, what's running through my head is if you're just now writing proposals, you don't want to know all of that, what Erik just told you. But especially the part about maybe your proposal was perfectly fundable, but you didn't get funded. It means keep trying. The only thing I would add, though, is that there are also programs like EBSCOR that look at where funding has occurred more or less throughout the country. And West Virginia, in that sense, could benefit from some of the EBSCOR funding. Maybe we'll talk about that later. And the programs that I've reviewed for, including sociology, but also the ones in education and human resources, They also did a lot of the making sure that the portfolio was diverse. And so a lot of that had to do with ensuring that institutions, not just the R1s, but also R2s and institutions that are primarily focused on teaching, even the colleges and liberal arts schools, that those were represented along with HBCUs, tribal colleges, and Hispanic serving institutions.
Let me just say one more point before we go to the next question, just to build off what Sharon said. If you are working on proposals right now or thinking about working on proposals, there are things you can do to enhance your competitiveness, both in terms of just the quality of your project so it becomes something recommended by panel and ad hoc reviewers and looked upon favorably by program officers, but also to think about how it fits into bigger portfolio issues to make yourself more likely to get funded. And we can talk about those as they come up.
So you mentioned portfolio diversity as an EPSCoR's contribution to that. Can you talk a little bit, either of you talk a little bit more about what EPSCoR funding is and what that means and the process for that? Because just because you're a grant from an EPSCoR state doesn't mean you're going to get EPSCoR funding. So, and there's a separate funding that's specifically EPSCoR, direct EPSCoR funding, the EPSCoR 1, EPSCoR 2, but EPSCoR funding as it applies to a general standard submission. If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. I have a couple of perspectives on that. One, having been a part of EPSCoR funding states, Oklahoma State, where I came from previously, also received EPSCoR funding. And in my experience, it was always the projects that were really collaborative, that were designed to meet particular regional needs that were most likely to receive the funding. And the set aside is not the right word here, but what EPSCoR means is established program to stimulate competitive research. And Erik, did you want to jump in?
In terms of the terms of the practical use of EPSCoR, at least within SBE and the programs that I'm familiar with, it provided additional resources for programs to fund projects, particularly those that were meritorious but might be on the edge. So if there's a West Virginia University project and it's the highest ranked among the panel, it gets all excellence from the ad hoc reviewers, and we as program officers are able to justify it within the context of budget and within the context of portfolio, it's not going to get EPSCoR funding because it doesn't need EPSCoR funding. EPSCoR funding isn't just for projects from states, but in a practical sense, it's used to, from a program director's perspective, you get an extra project funded. If you've got a couple on the edge, you're able to make the claim that, and successfully make the claim that without the EPSCoR funding, this project probably wouldn't be funded. You can extend your program. So there are a number of states. Senator Rockefeller is the person who started the EPSCoR program. So West Virginia has always been an EPSCoR state, but there are lots of EPSCoR states now. And so there's a lot more competition for that EPSCoR funding in principle. In practice, you don't have to think a lot about it if you're applying to a standard program, but just be aware it's a mechanism that is in our favor as faculty at an institution in an EPSCoR state, and it can help on the margins move you from maybe not getting funded to getting funded.
And as Kirk notes in chat, that it helps with your portfolio diversity image. But Sheena asks, what happens if you have something that is ranked highly meritorious but is not funded? Is there any sort of recourse? That's a tough question. What do you do?
Do you want me to start, Sharon, or you want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. So you need to find out why. It appears to be ranked in a meritorious way and you're not funded. I will tell you the most common reason in the programs I worked in, and I could say probably across SBE, that you get high ratings and you're not funded, is that you are offering something that the reviewers find valuable, but it doesn't really fully comply with or complete what the program needs to justify funding. And the most common way for that to happen is you are collecting some kind of valuable data, but your project seems like an infrastructure project, not theoretically driven. So we would often have projects discussed on panel that were going to collect a certain kind of data, and the panelists, you could tell, wanted those data. And they loved the project, but the project had no theory, or if it had theory, the theory and the research design weren't very well connected. And the reviews might mention this, but they essentially inflate the grade because the data seems so valuable. And one of the things I often had to say to PIs was, if we were in a world where the program, our program, had unlimited resources, we would probably fund your project, but we don't have unlimited resources. And so in a program of, like a $10 million budget, which was political science, I mean, that doesn't fund a mirror in one of Duncan, or not a mirror, in a major telescope, or one of your arrays in a radio telescope. I mean, $10 million is nothing by NSF standards. The Science of Organizations had $3 million budget. So we really have to be careful about how we determine what projects can be funded and what projects can't. And it's on the kind of theory side that we make those decisions. Where are the contributions going to be, and how do you articulate how you as a PI are building knowledge in your field? So that may not be your situation. You want to find out by looking at the reviews carefully, by looking at the panel summary carefully, by consulting with the research office. The ECAS research office can help you decipher some of this, and then potentially setting up an appointment to talk to the program director. All of those steps can help you figure out what to do next. But I would say, again, the most common reason for a project to be rated highly and not get funded is it actually is lacking in something that isn't reflected in the ratings.
Sharon, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, quickly, I would agree with pretty much everything that Erik said. That was my experience as well. The limitation on funding, you only have so many dollars to disperse each year. And I know that some program officers will say, if you got those kinds of ratings, just submit the proposal, look at the reviews, see what modifications you need to make. The harder part is what Erik was talking about. If there was something theoretically lacking, or it's not in the eyes of the program officer filling a particular need in the portfolio, or it's not innovative enough. And all of that, in my mind, means having a conversation with the program officer. And you won't walk away from that meeting feeling super elevated and inspired because you still didn't get money. I mean, that was mostly my experience. You still did not get funding, but you're on the radar of that program officer. And if you will be persistent, that's one of the keys to all of this. Just be persistent, you'll get funding.
So that's a question we get a lot, is should I just call up the program officer and talk to them about my project? And could you offer some guidance? I'll start with you, Sharon, before I ask Erik, because I know part of his answer, but are there some guidelines to how to contact a program officer, and when to, and what to contact them about?
Yeah, it depends on what you're calling for. If you're calling to complain, forget it. But if you're calling to get some constructive feedback, do approach the program officer with an understanding that they will have so many calls within a day they can't keep up. So they're triaging their emails and phone calls just like you are. That said, most of the program officers are pretty excited about being helpful, at least the ones that I interacted with. And so if you will contact them by email, if you don't respond, you contact them by phone. If you're contacting them because you have an idea, then a one-pager that outlines your idea is very instrumental. Don't call to say, I just had this thought, can you help me work through it? Stuff like that. Of course, you don't want to do that. So do your homework before you make that call. If it's about a proposal, though, that didn't get funded, call with a certain disposition that says, I want to have the feedback so that I can do this better the next time.
And I can say that in terms of everything Sharon said is right. When we were working as program directors, we wanted to help. I mean, everyone's on your side at the NSF. Having said that, do not cold call, in my experience. In fact, I stopped answering my phone at the NSF for all sorts of reasons. But part of the reason was I would get calls from prospective PIs who had not done due diligence. 30-second Google search would get them the answer that they were calling me about. And I was wasting a lot of my time. And you do not want to antagonize program directors, and wasting their time is a big way to antagonize program directors. So do due diligence. What I would do is not answer the phone. I would get a message and I would follow up, usually by looking people up and emailing them with some boilerplate, but also some direct responses to whatever questions they had. And the boilerplate was two parts. And I think it's important for all of you to think about this before you contact the NSF. One, did you look at the grant proposal guide? Here is a link to the grant proposal guide. Here are the things you should be looking for. Two, did you look at the database of funded projects? The database is available. It's a little hard to navigate, but the research office can help you do that. You can download a spreadsheet of every project ever funded in your area. So for example, in political science, until the program was split into two, if you would put in a particular code, 1371, in the online search form, you would get access to every single project funded, the amount, who got it, the abstract, really incredible information that can help you formulate the right questions. And that's the kind of due diligence before you apply that you should use before setting up an appointment to chat. If you're focusing on something that was not funded, carefully read through your reviews and think about the questions that would be most helpful for you to improve the project, because the program director wants to encourage you to try again, but they want you to be really attentive to what the review process revealed about the deficiencies of your project. So come into it with an open mind, and you'll get valuable feedback.
So Jamie asked the question, and I kind of anticipated this question would come up. So I want to ask, since you're both social scientists, there have been a lot of questions. I get a lot of questions about qualitative and quantitative research and what the NSF will fund. GSS was recently changed to HEGS, and they put out an FAQ that included a statement that's specifically stating a proposal to the HEGS program must explain how the research will contribute to geographic and spatial scientific theory and or methods development, and how the results are generalizable beyond the case study. Can you talk a little bit about this generalizability perspective and how it is used through SBE?
Do you want me to start?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Just very basically, the National Science Foundation funds science. Many of the SBE disciplines have a diverse set of approaches that scholars use to pursue their research. And that's great. And I think that the disciplines embrace this. And in many ways, the NSF embraces it, except if your project is not scientific in its orientation, it's not a fit for the NSF. There are other places you could potentially seek funding. Now, whether it's qualitative research or quantitative research is not really the issue. It has to do with the orientation toward a scientific approach to studying the phenomenon you're interested in. So we funded in political science a lot of qualitative work. We even funded, every year I was there, a qualitative data repository and a qualitative summer methods program. So the program itself, the political science program, was really supportive of qualitative research, but all research doesn't fit the NSF, just as all research doesn't fit the NIH and the NEH and so on. And so you've got to figure out where your work best fits and resonates.
Do you want to add anything to that, Sharon?
Sure. And we're still answering the question that Jamie asked.
Well, let me, Jamie and I have had previous conversation, but in addition, Jamie is asking, okay, so what do you do now if your program is not a good fit? Do you then submit to another program within SBE? And would that fix the problem, or would that cause you even more problems because you're outside of that field?
Okay, and so we're talking about qualitative research in particular?
Let's talk about qualitative research or research that's not necessarily generalizable.
Okay, I'm then just piggybacking on what Erik said. I have found that when reviewing proposals that have qualitative components, if it's a component that's part of a mixed methods approach, that often is more enticing to the reviewer. If it is purely qualitative, then it is, in my experience, it's very important to articulate why this is especially appropriate for the type of project that you're doing, but it still has to contribute to whatever the goals of the program are. So you have to be careful about the program solicitation itself. Also, a part of the question, at least the one that was asked in the chat box, was it doesn't, maybe it doesn't fit under the program that I'm looking at. Could I look at other programs? And in sociology, that's not uncommon. We do get cultural geographers, for example, who will submit their programs to sociology programs as long as they are seeking to answer the kinds of questions that are appropriate for that program. So that's not a limitation. It's a little tougher though, because if it's submitted to sociology and the program officer selects reviewers who are primarily sociologists, then just remember you need to be able to craft your proposal in a way that is accessible to a broader audience of reviewers.
In that type of situation, is it beneficial to have a collaborator who's within the discipline you're applying to?
It often is. It's also really helpful to have your proposal read by somebody who's submitted to that program before. So if you have a colleague, whether at your own institution or another institution, who's gone the route that you're interested in taking or trying, that would be great. In fact, one of the common problems that I saw with proposals was that the person who put it together appears not to have had any colleague look at what it was they proposed, not having reviewed it to make sure that all the necessary components are there. And so, broaden your networks and get the persons in your Office of Sponsored Research to help you out, start that process early. The question about qualitative, though, it always comes up. And I think that a lot of the barriers with qualitative research, and I'm a person who's done that work before, I've always been more successful, and my colleagues have been more successful when they submit proposals that are using mixed methods, so that the qualitative research itself is helping to bolster the overall project in some way. And Erik may have other suggestions about more purely qualitative work.
Yeah, I want to actually just build a little bit on what Sharon said about program fit and so on. One of the things I often recommend to prospective PIs is make sure that you are looking at the range of programs and also special programs that the NSF has. So there are two new ones that are being sort of revealed very soon, and solicitations are coming out. And one is on human networks, and the other is really targeting collaborations with minority serving institutions. And these kinds of programs are common. That is, new programs will emerge and some old ones will disappear. Non-standing disciplinary programs typically, but kind of special initiatives. In addition to Dear Colleague letters, which solicit for special topics of interest. But within the standing programs, there are often smaller programs that may be a fit that you never thought of. I have to admit, I got funded by the Science of Organizations program. After I was the program director, I wasn't even aware of the Science of Organizations program until I was at the NSF. And make a very long story short, when Congress curtailed some of the activities of political science, they had to have me do something. And so they shifted me over to the Science of Organizations to fill in. And in fact, a lot of my work fit very well with some of the initiatives that Science of Organizations was designed to fund. It was really oriented toward economists, people who are in business schools and so on, but political scientists and sociologists and others also would receive funding. So seek out programs that fit your work and either apply or request co-review. And co-review is a really good way to get more feedback and potentially other outlets for funding. The challenge is the more programs that look at your work, the more difficult it can be to especially have the theoretical approach speak to the disciplinary reviewers within those. But that's something, again, the research office can try and help you navigate. But I do think co-review, looking for special programs, looking for smaller programs is a winning strategy with the NSF.
So you mentioned smaller programs. Another option is that there are other types of funding, such as EAGRs and RAPIDs. And Sharon, you've had an EAGR, and Erik, you've had a RAPID. So Sharon, would you talk a little bit about what that means and how that differs from a standard proposal?
Yeah, with the EAGR, I guess in particular, it's an early concept type of proposal. It's not the type of proposal that would be suitable to go in under a regular program solicitation. The objective with these EAGR proposals is that they're higher risk, higher reward. And if you're developing a concept or a proof of concept, EAGR proposals are great. They're shorter in length when you're putting the proposal together. They would be like 8 pages. And you need to, not like, they are a max 8 pages. And you would need to speak with a program officer in advance about the idea that you have. I have found, though, that with the EAGR proposals, if you have a concept that involves a small number of, say, participants, or if you're doing interviews or something like that, maybe even more qualitative in nature, that an EAGR can be useful to develop the concept that is scalable. So it starts small and it's something that could grow, become bigger. You could use it as the foundation for a broader proposal sometime in the future. And there are a lot of other components to it that I'm happy to speak to.
I would just say that EAGRs really do vary in their usage by program, though. So in political science, we did not give out very many EAGRs. In computer science, and I interacted with them in the Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace program, they used the EAGR mechanism quite a bit. So this is where looking at the database of funded projects will be really helpful, because EAGRs, RAPIDs, and others typically have that designation in the title. So you'll be able to see, if you look up sociology or any other program, what kinds of projects have been funded through the EAGR mechanism. And they are different than standard proposals. RAPIDs, just very briefly, it's response to an unexpected event. So the coronavirus pandemic is a perfect example.
And Dan is on the call here.
Yeah,
and
Dan has a RAPID from the NSF in terms of the response to the coronavirus pandemic. Many were given out for research on Hurricane Katrina and its effects. In political science, it's often the case when, say, special elections or snap elections are called for particular reasons, you might get a RAPID. But the key is it's an unexpected event. So I would often field calls in political science around this time of year, in even numbered years, of people who wanted to talk to me about RAPIDs for the US presidential election. And my response is, US presidential elections happen on a schedule every 4 years. You do not need a RAPID for this. You should have applied for a standard proposal. And so regularly occurring events are not appropriate for RAPIDs. Unexpected events are what's appropriate for RAPIDs.
I can't help but ask a quick question, Erik. So if it's about about elections that do happen every 4 years, yes, indeed. But under the conditions of a pandemic, would that be appropriate for a RAPID?
So one thing that, I would consider if I were in the program director's seat now, is if there were really special conditions, like with the pandemic, and there was a specific question that I felt like could only be addressed in that way. In other words, it's not going to be picked up by the American National Election Survey, which is funded every year by the political science program, and might kind of pick up some of these issues. So this would be an exceptional year because it's not really about the presidential election or the election in the US. Rather, it's about the intersection of this unexpected event and the election. In a similar way, if there were some kind of natural disaster around the time of the election, like Hurricane Sandy happened, and there were elections that had to adjust, regularly scheduled ones that had to adjust quickly, I'd consider, if I were a program director, funding for something like that. So I do think that, you know, something that happens in a regular schedule is generally not appropriate for a rapid, but if there is some additional circumstance which makes it unusual and it is an unexpected circumstance, then it's something worth talking to the program directors about. And these are rapids are special mechanisms you send, depending on the program, a 1 or 2 page proposal. They either say yes or no to that 1 or 2 page proposal without a review process. That is, the program directors themselves review it, and that's it. If you get asked to submit, you are essentially going to be funded. It's not, there's some complications, but essentially you're going to be funded. And if you are told no, you won't get any feedback, you won't get any reasons, you just move on with your life. So rapids are a little different in that way.
You talked a little bit about having somebody else look at your proposal, Sharon, and Sheena has mentioned in here that we can send proposals out for review. It usually takes about 3 weeks to get feedback from the external reviews. And also, I should mention that our office can review your proposals for you. But Sharon and Erik, could you both talk a little bit about things things that you have found with really good proposals, that are aspects that make proposals really good or that have helped you be successful with your proposals? Like, what makes for a good proposal?
Not to be obvious, but following directions. Having somebody review and make sure that you've actually checked all the boxes. And I know that that's part of what Leah and Erica and folks in the research office, that's what they do. So do start early with making sure that you've completed all the appropriate portions of the actual proposal. Other things, though, that make for a good proposal, I've found that getting the experience beforehand, and I know that's also hard if you're a new assistant professor and you're thinking, I need to write proposals now, to invest the time a little bit in advance, though, to take a look at some of the proposals that have been submitted by your colleagues, or perhaps if you have served as a researcher on a grant proposal, you know, obviously that's going to be helpful. So if your colleague asks you, would you like to do that? If you consider it as a learning process that enables you to see what a good proposal looks like, then it's a really worthwhile investment. Similarly, the opportunity to review proposals is the best way to figure out what a good proposal looks like, what gets funded and what doesn't, in addition to searching the databases that Erik was talking about. But in terms of putting the actual proposal together itself, I find that making sure that you're speaking to an audience that is broad enough, that it's not so packed with the lingo of your particular subfield or subfield, that you're going to be better off than if you write to the 4 people who understand what you're trying to do. Other aspects of good proposals, there's a lot of homework that goes into it beforehand. If you're in the process of working through an idea, the proposal isn't the place to put that. Working, you know, through your ideas process, you know, or your bullet points or whatever. You should have refined your idea. My colleagues in sociology will say that a proposal is a research project that's already half done, and that's to give you an idea of how much research you would have done before you put the actual proposal together. I don't know that I would go that far, but it's true. You have to be able to make some arguments in your proposal that are compelling to an audience, and the arguments need to demonstrate that you know what the unanswered questions are. And if you're proposing to do something novel that's not novel, you're not going to get very far.
So let me just build on that. I think all that is great advice. Clarity, especially when it comes to your response to the review criteria. So the NSF only has 2. Other funding agencies have more. Intellectual merit, broader impacts. If you are not clear about the intellectual merit, how you are building knowledge in your field and how that knowledge is generalizable, if you are not clear about broader impacts, how you are going to benefit communities, not just in academia, and that you have a clear plan and you have experience doing that, then it's going to be really difficult to be competitive. and you want to make your case as directly and again clearly as possible. And so not sending in a first draft, having it reviewed by the research office, by colleagues, you have to think about shopping this around to as many people who are willing to give you feedback as possible, because sometimes having someone outside your field is the best kind of reader, because the panels, even though they may be in your discipline, all of our disciplines have different subfields who have specialized literature and specialized language, and they're on the panel, and you have to convince them that your project is meritorious. You need theory, I've mentioned this already, and you need theory that is connected to the research design clearly. So it's wonderful if you have a well-developed theory, but if it's not obvious how your research design is going to build knowledge based on that theory, it's not going to go very far. Having proof of concept, whether that's pilot data or some other way to demonstrate that you're the right person to do this and that the project is likely to be successful. So Jamie is in geography, and she probably knows that geography really spearheaded additional review criteria that aren't technically part of the merit process, but in geography, you also receive reviews about how likely it is your project will be successful and what kind of an impact your project would have if it were successful. And you should think about those criteria as you're writing, even though they're not technically within the NSF's full merit review criteria. So I think all of those pieces are really important to building a successful proposal. And just as a last point, don't antagonize reviewers or the program officers. Make it easy for them to see that you are responding to these things. Don't bury the criteria in, sort of academic language that is difficult to decipher unless you are a specialist. Some of that can be necessary in a proposal, but you want it to be clear to a reviewer in your field. And science of organizations, but I don't know what it's called now. Law and social science is what it used to be called.
Law and science.
Law and science. Many programs within SBE are multidisciplinary programs. So you actually will have people outside of your field on the review panels. So you need to make sure that you can make that case and make it easy for them to see how you've made the case.
So speaking of good proposals, let's talk about what makes for good broader impacts that's brought up in the chat here. I see a lot of proposals that say, I work with a lot of graduate students, or say, I'm in an EPSCoR state. Are those the kinds of things that should be in broader impacts? What is a bad broader impacts and a good broader impacts, and how important is that? Whichever one of you wants to go first.
I like the question. Thanks for a good question, Dan. I like it because this is a land-grant institution, and a land-grant institution has so many mechanisms for engaging in doing broader impacts. A lot of people think broader impacts means broadening participation, involving underrepresented minority groups in the research that you do, which is great, and you should do that, and have a postdoc mentoring plan if you have a postdoc, all those, the usual things. But I spent 17 years at Iowa State University, also a land-grant institution that takes that mission very seriously. And so our broader impacts in our proposals would almost always include developing white papers and holding one-day conferences for the regional farmers or the landowners, the people who care about water and water rights and things like that, that we would invite them to our institution. Now, those aren't necessarily all built in, but they're also not that hard to figure out how to do. Those are examples of broader impacts. The engagement, and Dan alluded to this, but engagement with undergraduate students, engagement with local community members. One of the proposals that I really loved seeing funded when I was at NSF was one that helped to create a dissemination plan across the islands of Hawaii. Because if you want to talk about remote, you can't get from one island to another in most cases without getting on a boat or a helicopter. And so their broader impacts actually involve connecting communities virtually through these mini conferences and such. And I think I'll stop there.
I would add to that, all of these things should be a part of, or you should consider as a part of your broader impacts. the key is not to have broad statements. In political science, we would often get, well, my research is relevant for policymakers. Well, wonderful. All research can be relevant for policymakers. How will you make it relevant for policymakers? And how can we know that you have the ability to disseminate that information among policymakers? So for early career scholars who may not have a lot of networks, you probably do have social media. You can work with the media offices at the university to publicize your research and to get it out there. So that is a part of broader impacts, speaking to the public about your work. As you build networks, you can incorporate that into your broader impact plan. So I have, over my career, increasingly been in contact with people. So in my field, policymakers do matter, policymakers in various areas of the US government and governments abroad. And I'm able to draw on that and say, well, I have, been in workshops with members of the Central Electoral Commission of Ukraine, and I will work with those networks to disseminate this information, and so on. Obviously, different stages of your career and different types of work that you do will speak to different communities, and again, you will have different networks at different points in your career. So you don't have to be too concerned if, again, you're an early career scholar that you don't have wide networks. You still have ways to disseminate your work to a diverse set of communities. So in addition to training students, in addition to diversifying the research workforce and so on, you can also get your work out to a non-academic audience in ways that are meaningful and prove that you can do it. Because for the last few years, you've had to not only have a wish list for your broader impacts, but really a plan.
How should the broader impacts and intellectual merit relate to each other?
Well, I'll take this briefly, Sharon, then I'll hand it off to you. I think there are two pieces to this. One is, we often get asked, are they equal? And the official answer at the NSF is yes. The real answer in many programs is no.
I guess my question was more, should the broader impacts arise out of the intellectual merit, and should it be something that arises out of the grant as opposed to something you already do?
Well, it could be both, right?
Okay.
But I would just say that sometimes strong broader impacts and weak intellectual merit would get funded, but that was much rarer than strong intellectual merit and weak broader impacts. You need both, but they don't have to be equally as strong. But if one is going to be stronger than the other, it's the intellectual merit. And they are related to one another. But I do think that what you don't want in your broader impacts plan is for it to look like your boilerplate list of, I know that the NSF is looking for these particular things, so I'm going to let them check boxes. It needs to be more than that. And that's where integrating the ideas with what you are doing, either as a scholar generally or in the project specifically, will make it more, will make it review better.
Sharon, do you want to add to that?
I'll just be quick. I second those general emotions, everything that Erik was saying. And I would say that they hold really true across most of the directorates. There may be an exception, though, with education and human resources. If you're doing a project that has intellectual merit because you're advancing knowledge about the science of learning, the broader impacts and the intellectual merit are often difficult to distinguish. They're mutually reinforcing. And so it will depend on which program you're submitting to, and perhaps even the particular solicitation as to the extent to which they will emphasize the importance of broader impacts. And that may be difficult to decipher. So if you have further questions, talking to a program officer is probably a good idea.
So a question has been posted about that there's no longer a requirement that you have a heading, that you have a separate intellectual merit section, but you have to have a separate broader impact section. Do you have anything you want to add about that? Or I can address it from a technical perspective, but do you think, should there still be an intellectual merit section?
Well, I just start the sentence with the intellectual merits are and the broader impacts are. I mean, I still use that language because signaling to the reviewer that you knew that you were supposed to address that is still very important. And the fact that you have addressed it is still very important.
I suspect the changes, number one, because the NSF is constantly changing the proposal guide. There's an office of policy that wouldn't have much to do if they weren't doing that on a regular basis. But I think the argument is probably, well, your whole proposal has to speak to the issue of intellectual merit. But I think Sharon's got it exactly right. You have to use the words that are in the merit review criteria. Whether or not they're section headings, you need to signal to reviewers that you understand the criteria and that you meet or exceed the criteria.
We only have a few minutes left, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat right away. And so while you're doing that, let me ask Sharon and Erik, what are things that make for a bad proposal? What are things to avoid as a PI?
That's a fun question. Because we only have a few minutes, though, I want to be sure to say this. If you're preparing a proposal and your program has the opportunity to participate in a webinar, do it. And if you're unable to attend the webinar, go and view it because they're usually recorded online. They have some really good ones about career proposals in particular, and I'm sure our office has already indicated all of that. But what makes a bad proposal? That's where we're at. So many things. Not using the space that you're allotted, not following all the details about putting together things like your budget. But we've kind of been talking about the pitfalls, the things that you don't want to do. Like you don't want to submit a proposal that hasn't been, nobody else's eyes have seen it. Even if you think you know exactly what you're talking about. I found that folks who did that, they spoke to a narrow audience, way too narrow. Think about who your audience is when you're submitting your proposal so that the language that you're using will be accessible enough to the people who sit on the panel and review the proposal. I'll let Erik jump in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what makes a bad proposal is in some respects what we've been talking about, and Sharon pointed out really all the things that I would want to mention. I think the one item that I would add is that you have to navigate very difficult territory when it comes to submitting. Try not to ever submit a proposal that isn't ready to go, because your reputation is associated with that proposal. I have heard of institutions where people are encouraged, in part because of the incentive structure of the promotion and tenure process and so on, just to throw something in to the NSF to say you've done it. Not only is that clear to the program directors and the reviewers, and it creates a lot of work for people on something that they shouldn't have to even be looking at, but it creates a problematic reputation for you and or for the institution. And so just be mindful of that. Having said that, it doesn't have to be perfect to send it in, because we all know that our work's never perfect anyway. So when you get to a point where you feel like the work is crafted well and it should be competitive in your mind, give it a shot. Don't be paralyzed by the concern about how a negative review might affect your reputation. A lot of really good political scientists and famous political scientists got horrible reviews. I can't name names, but I look at them and I say to myself, I know these are great scholars. Either, they just didn't have a good proposal or didn't write it in a compelling way. And that's okay. That happens to all of us. So what you don't want to do is antagonize or waste people's time. And then that's where, if it's a 15-page proposal and you use 5 pages of it, and I've seen that, you're wasting people's time. Because if you only have 5 pages to write on your project, then why would we fund it?
We're running out of time, and I know some people may have to leave. I want to try to squeeze in 2 quick questions for both of you. You've mentioned being part of the review process and being a panelist, and that's been helpful. Can you talk a little bit about how you select reviewers and how our faculty can position themselves to be selected as reviewers?
I can go. So the first part of your question is kind of the reviews and how you get selected, or how the program officer selects reviewers. I think I want to answer the other question first, though. The sitting on review panels, thinking back to when I was an assistant professor and I was asked to serve on a review panel, and at that point in time, I wasn't even sure what all that would entail. It wasn't from the National Science Foundation, but a senior colleague said, just say yes, just do it. You might get advice like that. I think it's probably good advice. And you might also feel like really underqualified to do the work, but try to just go with it. That experience is tremendously beneficial in helping you to understand what kinds of language you put into a proposal and what kind of language you don't, because the way you read things, the way you use language is not necessarily the way that other people do. So say yes. The other piece of that, when the program officers are selecting reviewers, you may have contacted a program officer in the past and said, hey, I would love to review, and then you don't get a call back. Well, that might be because they're not even in the cycle for reviewing proposals at that particular moment in time. So being persistent is a good idea. Also, letting other colleagues know that you're willing to review. They might put forth your name. I still get asked by people who want to serve on proposals or review processes, how do I do that? And I always forward their name to my networks to program officers who serve at NSF, and that can be helpful. But persistence is probably the key. The other part, like how does the program officer select reviewers? It ranges, but they often go back to a set of reviewers that have reviewed for them before, but they're always trying to add new reviewers. You can review as a brand new assistant professor. It's just a little bit harder to get your name out there. And that's why talking to your colleagues and letting them know that you'd like to do that. Maybe your colleague is asked to serve on a panel. They can't, but they can recommend you in their place, and that will go a long way. I'm sure there are many other suggestions that Erik has.
No, I think that was pretty much the list, with the exception of, in your regular role as an academic, you're going to publish. And as you publish and as your work gets associated with a particular research agenda, you're going to be called upon to do reviews in that area. And so to the extent that you build your reputation through conference work and through publications, you will get asked to do things like review and serve on panels. So the research component will feed into that.
Well, last, I want to ask you, is there anything else you want to share about your experience at NSF with our faculty here? Positive, negative, or tips or secrets or anything else that you'd like to share with them?
The NSF program directors and the whole program is not, it's on your side. The conversations that happen after panels and when decisions are being made about what doesn't get funded, people who work there really want to see good work funded, but they have really limited budgets as well. So go into this recognizing that they're not your enemy, they're on your side, but they are operating under some serious constraints. And so you have to make their job easier, their job to fund you easier. And there are lots of ways that you can do that.
Sharon, would you like to add anything?
Nope, that's a good point.
All right. Our next brown bag will be October 20th. It will be on budgeting. There is a quick budget masterclass, and then November 17th will be insights into the NIH. There is in chat a link to fill out a quick survey, if you don't mind, about the presentation today. We'd like feedback from people. Also feedback on topics you'd like to hear from us about. So I just want to thank Sharon and Erik for giving their time today to the office. It was great information and I learned a lot. So thank you so much. Duncan, do you have anything to add? No?
No, just to thank the speakers again. It was really informative. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone.